The views expressed on the following broadcasts do not necessarily reflect those of KHLT, Take 12 Radio, or our affiliates. The opinions on this show should not be considered as medical, psychological, or professional advice and are those of the host, co-host, and guest. Take 12 Radio and KHLT Recovery Broadcasting are not affiliated with any particular 12-step fellowship.
One day at a time with its failures and fears, with portion of pain and burden of care, we must meet.
Welcome to Walking Through the Language of the Heart, a journey into the Grapevine writings of Alcoholics Anonymous co-founder Bill W. And now, here are your co-hosts, Chris S. and the Monty'man.
Well, welcome back, one and all, to another episode of this great show that we just have so much fun with, Walking Through the Language of the Heart, referring to the book, The Language of the Heart, Bill W.'s Grapevine writings from 1944 to 1970, with our good friend Chris S. And Chris, we're actually on part 2, picking up from last week, the article, A Fragment of History, Origin of the 12 Steps. And I listened to this show again, and I'm excited about part 2 because I was waiting in part one for him to go a little deeper on where these actually came from. You know what I mean?
Yes, I do.
He referred to the people that influenced him, but where did they really come from? So maybe we'll find that out this week.
Maybe this is such an interesting article. Like, what could be more interesting than the origin of the 12 steps?
Yeah.
For somebody in recovery, because you and I have both been impacted,
Yep.
completely by the practice of these steps, and so obviously it's going to be of interest to us to see, just where they came from. So we'll pick up. We're on page 198, and this article was written in July 1953. So Bill had just explained how Ebby had helped him get sober. He'd gotten the Oxford group, and he made a serious determination that he was going to sober up drunks. That was going to be what he was going to do. He kind of knew that it was good for him, for his sobriety, but it also was, the humanity of Bill. He saw all the suffering, and he experienced all the suffering, and he knew exactly how bad it was. And he went out there and he started to try to work with drunks. So he's bringing them to his house and trying to get him to the Oxford group. It was a very, very early days, and he was not having much success. And in the paragraph before we start, he said the only person he knew that was still kind of staying sober was Ebby. And so he was holding on to that. So we're going to pick up on the bottom paragraph of 198. What was the reason for all these fiascos? If Ebby and I could achieve sobriety, why couldn't all the rest find it too? Some of those we'd worked on certainly wanted to get well. We speculated day and night why nothing much happened to them. Maybe they couldn't stand the spiritual pace of the Oxford group's 4 absolutes of honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. Now the Oxford group had the absolutes, and in Akron, the absolutes stayed very, very popular and part of the recovery experience for a long time. Mm-hmm. And in New York, it was just more of a psychological area. There was more skeptical kind of people there. They got rid of the 4 absolutes very, very quickly, believing that alcoholics can't perfectly do anything. They can't absolutely do anything. The one characteristic, totally in common with all alcoholics was imperfection. But even today in Akron, you'll find the pamphlets that are on the four absolutes. So in fact, some of the alcoholics declared that this was the trouble. The aggressive pressure upon them to get good overnight would make them fly high as geese for a few weeks and then flop dismally. They complained too about another form of coercion, something the Oxford group called guidance for others. A team composed of non-alcoholic groupers would sit down with an alcoholic and after a quiet time would come up with precise instructions as to how the alcoholic should own his life. As grateful as we were to our Oxford group friends, this was sometimes tough to take. It obviously had to do with the wholesale skidding that went on. So quiet time, Monty.
Yes.
And again, this went on a long time in Akron, more so than in New York. But what quiet time looked like is they would get together, your family. If it was a weekend, you were going to be at a house party with a whole bunch of other people spending the weekend with them. If you were in the Oxford group, and they would do the morning meditation. And here's what it would look like. They would have a pen and paper, and they would go into contemplative meditation. And when a thought would come to them that they thought was guiding, they would write it down. So if in contemplation you came up with, bring Aunt Fanny a fruit basket, you would write that down. You would write down all these guided thoughts, believing that some of these thoughts were inspirations from God. Now, all these non-alcoholic Oxford groupers are sitting there and they're coming up with guided thoughts that have to do with the alcoholic. It became much more personal, like your guided thoughts were your business, but you would share them. When you came out of this meditation, and they would be put up against the four absolutes. So if bringing Aunt Fanny a fruit basket is absolutely pure, absolutely unselfish, absolute love and absolute honesty, that was a direction from God, and you brought Aunt Fanny a fruit basket. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If a thought came to you that you wanted to manage a female mud wrestling team, you would put that up against the four absolutes, and you would find that no, that is not an inspired thought.
Right.
We are not going to go in that direction. So that was the morning practice, and the alcoholics. This is interesting because he's explaining why this wasn't really working with the alcoholics when non-alcoholics were sharing their guided thoughts at the alcoholics. So that's very, very interesting.
That is interesting. So I've got to interject here because this is one of those examples of the more things change, the more they remain the same. There is a group, which I'll keep their name out of it, but it's a faith-based organization. And they do a thing called treasure hunts. And it's almost to the letter of this. And what they'll do is they'll take maybe 12 people and they'll gather together and they'll stay in quiet meditation for 15, 20 minutes. And then they will write down whatever comes to their mind that they believe God is speaking to them. And then they'll share it with each other. So I might write down the color blue. Somebody else might write down a brick building. Somebody else might write down a bicycle, right? And so we'll put them all together, then we'll hop in cars, and we'll go look for somebody with a blue shirt riding a bicycle next to a brick building. And that'll be the guy that we're supposed to talk to about God.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. So it's very similar. They claim that that's a new revelation from God called treasure hunting. I would proclaim that it's not new, because the more things change, the more they remain the same. And there you go.
This type of, some people call it prayer, some people call it meditation, some people call it contemplation.
Yeah.
But this listening for God was something that they paid attention to. There's a pamphlet out, How to Listen for God, and it's an Oxford Group pamphlet, and it's passed around Alcoholics Anonymous all the time, because what it is it's the very, very early practice of listening for the guided inspirational thought.
Yeah.
So, if anybody if anybody listening is interested, Google How to Listen to God, Oxford Group pamphlet, and it's online, or you can buy a copy. They're cheap, but it's an amazing periodical. I mean, it truly is what they were doing in the first 5 or even 10 years of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's what they were doing.
So
I've
got to do a shameful plug here, because I wrote an excerpt on the back of this book for a gentleman and I'll show it to you. Listeners won't be able to see it, but this is a book called Basic Prayer and Simple Meditation by Mike D. A recovering alcoholic talks about beginning spirituality. And this is, I got to tell you, it is look, you can see how thin it is, right? It's an easy read, but this is the simplest and best explanation of what meditation is that I've ever read. And so, we talk all about prayer. We kind of know what that is, but so many people go, well, it really is meditation. I mean, are you sitting cross-legged on the floor with incense burning? And some people think that's meditation. Other people think it's going for a walk. And Mike says, listen, if you know how to worry, you know how to meditate. You already know how to do it.
That's true. That is true.
Yeah. So, but these are practices that really are a huge piece of the spiritual maturity that an alcoholic, if they're going to be successful, really needs to partake in one way or another, right?
The step 10 and step 11 really are deep forms of self-reflection.
Yeah.
And preparation and connection to the divine, preparation to be inspired by the divine and being connected to the divine. And meditation is not something that you have to do perfectly.
No,
it's a practice that should become routine. You should have a discipline for it, and I certainly have for many years. But it's part of the whole being in the realm of the spirit.
Yes. Well,
you know what I mean?
Yep, absolutely.
So I'll pick back up. But this wasn't the entire reason for failure. After months, I saw the trouble was mainly in me. I had become very aggressive and cocksure. I talked a lot about my sudden spiritual experience as though it was something very special. I had been playing the double role of teacher and preacher. In my exhortations, I'd forgot all about the medical side of our malady and the need for deflation at depth, so emphasized by William James, had been neglected. We weren't using that medical sledgehammer that Dr. Silkworth had so providentially given us.
Wow.
And what is that? That's the first step.
Yeah.
That's you're powerless.
Yeah.
You're powerless. And that's what Dr. Silkworth would consider certain alcoholics hopeless.
Yes.
Hopeless. Nothing you're going to be able to do. So if you're in that category, guess what? We have a solution. And Bill started to qualify people through what we would think today would be a first step experience. And that gives these drunks motivation, to pay attention to the rest of the spiritual process. So it would be like trying to take somebody through the steps without bringing them to step one.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Believe in a higher power. Why?
Right.
So this is really an interesting order.
Well, and the deal of it is, if I don't believe I'm powerless, then why would I seek a power? I wouldn't.
Yeah. I mean, in the beginning, once you've experienced, connection to this power, you're going to be hooked the rest of your life. But in the beginning,
Yeah.
yeah. What are you talking about?
Sure.
The alcoholic is experiencing toxic self-consciousness. So it's all about self. Like, listen to any brand new alcoholic. They just talk your head off about themselves.
Yeah.
Me, I, this is going on, that's going on. They're captured by self-consciousness. And so, the escape from that self-consciousness to God consciousness is the whole process of recovery.
And this is why, and I'm going to get in trouble here, but this is why some of my friends that are trying to recover, and they really believe they're alcoholic, but I don't know that they believe they're powerless, if that makes sense, because they're really trying to recover based on an agnostic or atheistic point of view, which leads them right back to depending on their own intellect. And everything is about, like you said, I this, I that, I this. And I read to you off the air a statement by an agnostic/atheist group,
Mm-hmm.
and I love them dearly, and I respect where they're coming from, but I don't know how you can say you're powerless and then turn around and lean on your own understanding. Then you're not powerless, are you?
Yeah. So your concept of a power, there's latitude. Right?
Yeah.
There's latitude in what your concept of a higher power is. But if you don't believe in a higher power, then you don't believe in a solution.
Exactly.
Because if you're powerless, then the solution is going to be power. Right?
Yeah.
So he's figuring out how to hook these people and hold on to them. You know what I mean? Like when I sit with an alcoholic who's really wants to get well, has never really experienced any 12-step groups or anything except maybe some therapy or whatever.
Sure.
The first thing I do is I talk to him about how much trouble you're in. Haven't you tried? Knowing what you know about alcohol and the risks you take drinking it, and the trouble you get in, the people you disappoint, and the things you miss out on, why are you still putting it in your body? That's insane. So I try to get them to that place where they start to believe, yes, I'm powerless, and once you get them there, they're going to pay attention to the power that you're gonna explain to them that's going to be the solution.
Right.
And the concept of that power, there's latitude.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
But you have to believe in a power.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what you haven't taken a first step. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You don't
Yeah.
think if you think you can overcome alcoholism without power, you can just do it by figuring it out. There was a guy who wrote a book just before Bill Wilson wrote the big book, and it was called The Common Sense of Drinking, right? And this book sold like hotcakes everywhere, and people that wanted to get over drinking bought it like crazy, But when you read this book, the book basically said, drinking is stupid. Don't do it. Right? And everybody read this book, but nobody got sober. You know what I mean? There's no common sense groups anywhere.
Right.
You know what I mean? So again, you and I are the choir. We keep preaching to each other. But okay, finally one day Dr. Silkworth took me back down to my right size. Said he, Bill, why don't you quit talking so much about that bright light experience of yours? It sounds too crazy. Though I'm convinced that nothing but better morals will make alcoholics really well, I do think you have the cart before the horse. The point is that the alcoholics won't buy all this moral exhortation until they convince themselves that they must. If I were you, I'd go after them on the medical basis first. While it has never done any good for me to tell them how fatal their malady is, it might be a very different story if you, a formerly hopeless alcoholic, gave them the bad news. Because the identification you naturally have with alcoholics, you might be able to penetrate where I can't. Give them the medical business first and give it to them hard. This might soften them up so that they will accept the principles that will really get them well. Wow. What a great paragraph that is, Monty.
Yeah, that's excellent.
And I'll tell you what, this is qualification. All right. What Dr. Silkworth is saying is qualify these people. And it's something that I do when I do 12-step work or I do sponsorship. I want the person to be sure they know what they're up against, and are they up against that? Are they alcoholic? Let's really look in your experience, because you might not be, not everybody that goes
right.
to AA is alcoholic, So, but if you are, and you do become convinced that you're in the classification of hopeless alcoholic, I think you're going to start to pay attention to the solution, and get motivated to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen.
Shortly after this history-making conversation, I found myself in Akron, Ohio on a business venture which promptly collapsed. Alone in the town, I was scared to death of getting drunk. I was no longer a teacher or a preacher. I was an alcoholic who knew that he needed another alcoholic as much as that one could possibly need me. Driven by that urge, I was soon face to face with Dr. Bob. It was at once evident that Dr. Bob knew more of spiritual things than I did. He also had been in touch with the Oxford group at Akron, but somehow he simply couldn't get sober. Following Dr. Silkworth's advice, I used the medical sledgehammer. I told him what alcoholism was and just how fatal it could be. Apparently, this did something to Dr. Bob. On June 10th, 1935, he sobered up never to drink again. When in 1939, Bob's story first appeared in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, he put one paragraph of it in italics. Speaking of me, he said, of far more importance was the fact that this was the first living person with whom I had ever talked who knew what he was talking about in regards to alcoholism from actual experience. Because Bill could talk to him about how many times he tried to stop. I tried, Bob, I tried 100 times. I wrote pledges in the Bible. I told all my bosses I was done drinking, and I kept drinking. And Dr. Bob is like about to lose his surgical practice, right? For anybody that doesn't know, Dr. Bob was a proctologist.
Yeah.
And he was running out of proctors to work on. There weren't a lot of people offering up their proctor to Dr. Bob, because he'd stink like alcohol all the time. And the whole hospital loved him, but they were worried about him. So he was one of these alcoholics in deep trouble. Dr. Silkworth had indeed supplied us the missing link, without which the chain of principles now forged into our 12 steps could never have been complete. Then and there, the spark that was to become Alcoholics Anonymous had been struck. During the next 3 years after Dr. Bob's recovery, our growing groups at Akron, New York, and Cleveland evolved the so-called word-of-mouth program of our pioneering time. As we commenced to form a society separate from the Oxford group, we began to state our principles something like this. 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. 2, we got honest with ourselves. 3, we got honest with another person in confidence. 4, we made amends for harms done to others. 5, we worked with other alcoholics without demand for prestige or money. 6, we prayed to God to help us do these things as best we could. Though these principles were advocated according to the whim or liking of each of us, and though in Akron and Cleveland they still stuck by the Oxford group absolutes of honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love, this was the gist of our message to incoming alcoholics up to 1939, when our present 12 steps were put to paper. So what Bill did with the 12 steps is he took these principles and he alcoholized them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He put him in 12 steps. He took and took all the loopholes that alcoholics have and got rid of them and gave it to us absolutely straight. And he was totally inspired when he put these steps together and he wrote how it works and into action. I really believe that in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. I well remember the evening on which the 12 steps were written.
There we go.
And this is
great. I'm getting excited.
I was lying in bed, quite dejected and suffering from one of my imaginary ulcer attacks. 4 chapters of the book, Alcoholics Anonymous, had been roughed out and read in AA meetings in Akron and New York. We quickly found that everybody wanted to be an author. The hassles as to what should go into our new book were terrific. For example, some wanted a purely psychological book which would draw in alcoholics without scaring them. We could tell them about the God business afterward. A few, led by our wonderful Southern friend, Fitz Mayo, wanted a fairly religious book infused with some of the dogma we had picked up from the churches and missions which had tried to help us. The louder these arguments, the more I felt in the middle. It appeared that I wasn't going to be the author at all. I was only to be an umpire who would decide the contents of the book. This didn't mean, though, that there wasn't terrific enthusiasm for the undertaking. Every one of us was wildly excited about the possibility of getting our message before all those countless alcoholics who still didn't know. Having arrived at chapter 5, it seemed high time to state what our program really was. I remember running over in my mind the word-of-mouth phrases then in current use. Jotting these down, they added up to 6 named above. Then came the idea that our program ought to be more accurately and clearly stated. Distant readers would have to have a precise set of principles. Knowing the alcoholic's ability to rationalize, something airtight would have to be written. We couldn't let the reader wiggle out anywhere. Besides, a more complete statement would help in the chapters to come, where we would need to show exactly how the recovery program ought to be worked. So he knows us by now. He's worked with 1 million alcoholics.
Yeah.
So he wants to put something together that you're not going to have any way out of. At length, I began to write on a cheap yellow tablet. I split the word-of-mouth program up into smaller pieces, meanwhile enlarging its scope considerably. Uninspired as I felt, I was surprised that in a short time, perhaps half an hour, I had set down certain principles which, on being counted, turned out to be 12 in number. As for some unaccountable reason, I had moved the idea of God into the second step right up front. Besides, I had named God very liberally throughout the other steps. In one of the steps, I had even suggested that the newcomer get down on his knees.
Yes, he did.
So that's the original manuscript.
Right.
In step 7, it said, humbly
on our
knees, we leaving nothing out.
Yes.
So that's kind of what he wrote in the original manuscript. Some of it was changed, but it's pretty much intact. When this document was shown to our New York meeting, the protests were many and loud. Our agnostic friends didn't go at all for the idea of kneeling. Others said we were talking altogether too much about God. And anyway, why should there be 12 steps when we had done 5 or 6? Let's keep it simple, they said. This sort of heated discussion went on for days and nights. But out of it all, there came a 10 strike for Alcoholics Anonymous. Our agnostic contingent, speared by Hank Parkhurst and Jimmy Burwell, finally convinced us that we must make it easier for people like themselves by using terms such as a higher power or God as we understand him. Those expressions, as well as we so well know today, have proved lifesavers for many an alcoholic. They've enabled thousands of us to make a beginning where none could have been made had we left the steps just as I originally wrote them. Happily for us, there were no other changes in the original draft, and the number of steps still stood at 12. Little did we then guess that our 12 steps would soon become widely approved by clergy of all denominations and even by our latter-day friends, the psychiatrists. Well, so picture Bill, like, not really doing very well, laying in bed. There were days when he just wouldn't get out of bed.
Yeah.
And he suffered from depression, and he's always ill, and just laying there and saying, I've got to put this together in a simple way for alcoholics. And he starts writing the 12 steps, and how important the 12 steps have become in our world today.
Yeah.
The amount of 12 steps, there's over 300 different 12-step programs, Monty.
Yeah.
If you have an obsessive compulsive disorder or an addiction or character traits that you just can't seem to overcome, there's a 12-step program for that. You know what I mean? There's a lip balm anonymous.
Yes.
For people with that tragic,
chapstick,
horrific addiction of putting too much lip balm on. And you can get a lip balm sponsor if you want to. I mean, it's just huge. The 12-step process. What it does is it puts you into contact with power that you don't have on your own.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Bill sat there and wrote it all out on his bed. It's just remarkable.
And the thing that I love about him, when you really begin to understand how these steps work, it's not that they're the power, it's that they point to the power. And it's fine in the beginning if people I used to be very critical of people that were meeting dependent. Hey, listen, if that's what you have to be in the beginning, cool. But like you've said before, the point of the steps is to move on from there, right? And so, we're meeting dependent for a while, and then we're step dependent, and we might bounce from step dependent to sponsor dependent, and eventually, though, as we apply the principles in those steps, then we become God dependent, and everybody's journey is a little bit different. I have a question for you: is there somewhere in a manuscript somewhere where Bill talks about his hand just started kind of writing these down and he maybe wasn't completely aware of what he was writing and he realized that this was God guiding him?
Yeah, he was in another place.
Yeah.
He was in another place because he came out of it and realized that it had been a half an hour.
Yeah.
And he looked on the page,
and
there were the steps.
Yeah.
I mean, he was writing them down.
He alludes to that
but
here.
He seemed to be in like an inspired state of mind or something. Yeah, he talked about that in some of his talks.
Yeah. That's amazing stuff. Wow.
This little fragment of history ought to convince the most skeptical that nobody invented Alcoholics Anonymous. It just grew by the grace of God.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank goodness it did. And I think even with all of its speed bumps, let's say, from coast to coast and worldwide, some of the things you and I have talked about New York and the difference between New York and Akron and stuff like that. But with all of its foibles, isn't it interesting how it has lasted and continues to grow even today, even with a society that seems to be losing their minds? The principles found in Alcoholics Anonymous and the fellowship therein still stand strong. And I'm amazed by that. And I have to say, I believe that is by the grace of God.
I believe so too. Listen, I'm a big, I'm a big observer of what's going on in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Like I keep up to date like a maniac on news and current events and political discourse and all of that stuff. I'm way interested in it.
Yeah.
Right. And what I see. What I see with the 12 steps is the 12 steps fit us to be useful and to try to cause no harm. right? And what I see out there in the world is I see people causing a lot of harm. They're not spiritually connected. They're being run by selfishness and self-centeredness. And a lot of times they're in positions of importance in the world.
Yeah.
And I'm just glad that I've been offered this way of being helpful and doing no harm.
Yeah.
Because the quality of my life is out of this world living that way.
Yeah.
I see people with yachts and private jets that are torn up emotionally and spiritually. And I wouldn't want to be them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So this is the way that I have to live. And there's something deep inside me, Monty, that says if I don't live this way, alcohol is going to cut me down.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
I know that deep inside.
Because we know it well, and we return to what we know when we don't stay to what we must stay to, what to be true.
One last thing. I think I talked about this last week, but it's still on my mind. I got a phone call from somebody that I've known for 17 years, and I've been in 15 different states with him doing events, and the phone call was I drank.
Yeah.
And once again, I was shown what we're up against. Once again, I was shown how cunning, baffling, and powerful this thing is. And Bill Wilson was inspired enough to put a series of steps together that are effective. They're effective for people like me to stay separated from alcohol and be very comfortable and doing so. Actually being grateful to doing so. And that was a wonderful article.
Yeah. When we say cunning, baffling, and powerful, it's not just baffling to the alcoholic, but to everyone around him, right? They're all going, what? I mean,
everybody's trying to figure out what he wasn't doing right.
Yeah.
So it doesn't happen to them. And
right.
And the book Alcoholics Anonymous says God has either removed their obsession to drink or God hasn't.
Yeah.
And within God is a great mystery.
Yeah. Very true. All right. We continue with Fragments of History next week, entitled Another Fragment of History, Sister Ignatia and Dr. Bob. So this ought to be good. I'm excited about that too. Those are two people that I love reading about. All right, Chris, thank you so much for another fine show. Folks, you can get caught up on all these. Just listen to the end of this as we close out to find out how. And until our next broadcast, this is the Monty'man along with Chris S., and we are wishing God's perfect serenity for you. For more recovery workshops with Chris S. and the Monty'man, visit our website at take12radio.com and click on the Recovery Workshops banner.
This has been a broadcast of Take 12 Recovery Radio and KHLT Recovery Broadcasting.
This has been a Chicken and a Pig production.
Kitty, 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 kitty. Meow, meow, meow.
Woof, woof.